Hey everybody. Um, this is a piece from New International, December 1948. It's from the collection uh, Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, edited by Haberkern and Lippau. The piece is titled The Nature of the Chinese State, and it's by a member of, or it's by a author named Jack Brad. The Nature of the Chinese State by Jack Brad. Throughout Asia, the post-war period has been one of vast social upheaval. What happened in Europe after the First World War is now happening in Asia after the Second, without the organizing technology of modern society, which links together great areas and peoples, and without extensive industry, which creates a more homogeneous and substantial working class. Asia's revolutions have taken varied forms. In no case have these changes been organized by a socialist revolutionary party basing itself on the workers. Leadership has fallen to national bourgeois classes, social democrats as in Burma, or to mixed elements of bourgeoisie and nationalist landlords. Though in most instances these elements have sought and obtained mass support from the peasantry and the working class, the leadership has never passed to these latter. Thus, the great transformation is taking place under conservative auspices and with limited objectives. While Stalinist parties exist in almost all the countries of Asia, and only two of them is the nationalist movement operative in the name of Stalinism as such, and only here does Stalinism so completely dominate the movement as to clearly stamp its own character on that movement in exclusive fashion, in China and in North Korea. Elsewhere, national bourgeois groups, India, Indonesia, Siam, Ceylon, social democrats, Burma, or landlord elements, South Korea, are in the forefront. In several of these countries, social democracy is active, India, Indonesia, Vietnam. This is a new, I don't know why I said Vietnam like a Vietnamese, how I usually say it, that's weird. This is a new phenomenon which deserves examination, since social democracy in colonial areas on a large scale is something new. Trotskyist or left anti-Stalinist groups exist on a larger scale than they do anywhere in the West in Ceylon, India, Burma, Indonesia, and possibly Indochina. The exception to the above pattern is Indochina, where the CP is a leading but not exclusive or completely dominant force. The reason for this is the protracted struggle which forces Indo-Chinese nationalism to seek international allies, that is, the national struggle is forced into the inter-imperialist framework. If warfare is renewed in Indonesia, as seems likely, the movement there may also be forced onto the alien tracks of Stalinism. Wherever imperialism has been too weak and has made serious concessions, Stalinism has had to take second place. Both China and Korea have this feature in common. In both countries, the two world powers face each other directly, creating a fixed inter-imperialist limitation to the struggle unless it took the road of social revolution. Without the alternative, and the reason for its failure in Asia needs to be studied, middle elements between the powers were doomed. In the revolt of Asia, which is one of the great new forces of the post-war period and which is the most dynamic progressive factor in the world today, only in China and North Korea has Stalinism become dominant. These two instances are deviations from the general pattern, for they represent a new tyranny and enslavement. Thus, in China, the U.S. supported Kuomintang rule. It's always weird pronouncing that word. Kuomintang rule, but at the same time tried to strengthen the, quote, liberals. This was the essence of Marshall's proposals, but neither the Kuomintang nor the CP wanted the liberals as U.S. spokesmen, and the liberals were too weak to accept such a role. The dolorous face of the Democratic League is the full history of Chinese liberalism. The Kuomintang is no longer, and has not been for many years, the party of nascent capitalism, unable to make headway against the continuous warfare and conquest of the Japanese. The bourgeoisie lost political power. Never fully emancipated from imperialism, part of it under Wang Qing Wei sold itself completely to Japan. Never fully divorced from usury and landlordism, it could not resist the growing dominance of feudalism over the Kuomintang. During the war, when the state was in the interior, removed from the seats of power of the bourgeoisie and dependent on the landlords. The Kuomintang, during the Qing period, became a narrow dictatorship resting on local landlord alliances in the distant provinces and on the Wham Pow clique of militarists who were personally sworn to Qing. The top families of the state utilized their monopoly of political and military power to take over the nation's economy. When the government moved back to Nanking, this economic power was extended to the entire economy. This bureaucratic state capitalism was anti-bourgeois. Its methods and practices were aimed at limiting and hampering the capitalist class. The Kuomintang had gone full cycle and become a brake on capitalist development. The Democratic League was largely representative of the intellectuals, the university professors, and the students. The key program was prevention of civil war through establishment of a national congress, in which all parties would be represented. This coincidence with the program of the U.S. for China and Marshall later singled out these men of the Democratic League as the, quote, splendid body of men, with whom alone he wished to work. Today, the Democratic League is underground in Kuomintang, China. Its main center is in exile in Hong Kong. The Democratic League's greatest aspiration is to enter a coalition with the Communist Party in an attempt to win minimal conditions for the survival of the bourgeoisie. The historical failure of Chinese capitalism is the fundamental underlying cause of the failure of American policy there. It was the only possible counterweight to socialist or Stalinist development. Chinese capitalism's failure opened the dikes to Stalinism as the leader of the, quote, national revolution. It is Stalinism which has fallen heir to the unfinished tasks of the bourgeois revolution begun in 1911. War since 1938 and 5 years under puppet rule have exhausted the capitalist class so that today, like the proletariat, it is a spectator in the Civil War, unable to determine its own future. Neither of the two great classes of modern society is a leading factor in the present Civil War. Capitalism failed in China because it was unable to solve a single one of China's pressing problems. Capitalism in China could not oust the imperialist. It could only shuttle between imperialists to sell itself to the highest bidder. Capitalism in China did not unify the country geographically, politically, or economically. Capitalism failed to develop a centralized state of representative character. Capitalism could not even begin to introduce the most moderate land reform because it was itself corrupted by usury land relations. Nor did it succeed in achieving the basic requisite of modern national existence, industrialization. Having failed in every one of these essentials, capitalism could not hold power against the landlords or the Stalinists, nor did capitalism have the strength to effectuate a new alliance with U.S. imperialism independent of the Kuomintang. Chinese capitalism is not alone in this defeat. It is doubtful indeed if any native capitalism will succeed in making itself the dominant force anywhere in Asia. In none of the new states emerging out of the disintegration of capitalist imperialism is there a bourgeoisie strong enough to rule by itself. Here this class tends to develop its power through state-controlled economy, and it is not likely that it will be able to assert itself on a purely economic basis. This is certainly one aspect of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution which remains valid. It is unlikely that classical capitalism is any more of a future in Asia than anywhere else. What forms will arise out of the dissolution of Oriental society are not clear as yet. Between Chinese feudalism and Stalinism, quote, liberal capitalism is being crushed. The same is true in Korea. The inter-imperialist conflict is precisely what creates the greatest difficulties for the native capitalists in these two countries. Thus, the inter-imperialist conflict establishes narrow limits for the national struggle, distorting the national struggle in its own interests. And where the U.S. intervenes, the U.S. forces the national leadership into Stalinist channels. All over Asia, the desire for national freedom goes hand in hand with the struggle against feudalism and the creation of modern industrialism. These are the social aspirations of the rising classes. Chinese Stalinism is an indigenous movement in the sense that Chinese Stalinism has secured to itself a monopoly of the leadership for these ends in China. Chinese Stalinism's party, program, and leadership are known and have established deep roots in the historical struggles of the last 20 years. Its name is linked with the desires of the peasantry. Chinese Stalinism's armies are Chinese, and nowhere in these armies is there an important amount of Russian power or Russian armaments. At least none has been revealed to this time. Like the Yugoslavs, the Chinese Stalinists are conquering without the Russian armies. The Chinese Stalinists are establishing their own tradition of victories and their own patriotism. This means that while the Chinese Communist Party is part and parcel of international Stalinism and takes its lead in all matters from the Kremlin, it is not a movement of Russian expansion in a simple sense, but the growth of a native Stalinism, which carries out the needs of Russian foreign policy on that native Stalinism's own. Chinese Stalinism is more like the Yugoslav Communist Party in this sense than, say, the Polish. Chinese Stalinism's leadership has not been russified by long years of residence in Moscow, although the Russians did bring the Russians' own Chinese commissars to Manchuria, who are now major factors in the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, and Chu Tai and Zhou Enlai have been in Moscow. The Chinese This party has fought its battles largely without Russian material or even diplomatic help. Not that Chinese Stalinism has had no help, but that help's kind and quantity is as nothing compared with U.S. help to the Kuomintang or Russian, quote, aid to the Polish Communist Party. These distinctions are important for the future. Thus, while the Chinese Civil War takes place within the context of the inter-imperialist struggle, this context distorts it, but does not so dominate it as to replace or overshadow the elements of national and social conflict. Only if the U.S. altered the U.S.'s policy to one of full intervention, and thus precipitated active Russian measures, could the Civil War become subordinated. But the inverse is not true either. The Communist Party of China is part and parcel of world Stalinism. The Communist Party of China's attitudes have always been governed by the latest requirements of Russian foreign policy, like every other communist party. The Communist Party of China's internal regime of hierarchy, discipline, bureaucracy, and idolatry for the leaders, including the entire Russian hagiography, as well as its slogans and foreign policy, have followed every zigzag of the Stalin turn. If you're unfamiliar with the Russian hagiography, it's kind of like celebratory biography. So, for instance, if I wrote, a book about Marx and just from a framework of hero worship and celebration, that would be a hagiography of Karl Marx. If you didn't know that. I just learned that word recently, that's why I'm telling you. Maybe it's an old familiar word to you. When Trotskyists were being purged in Moscow, the Trotskyists were also being purged in China. When the Bukharinist turn came in Moscow, it came too in China. One of the major crimes of Chinese Stalinism is Chinese Stalinism's utilization of the great agony of 400 million Chinese in the purposes of Russian foreign policy. Victory for the Communist Party does not remove China from the inter-imperialist struggle as a socialist victory would, but transfer the alliance to Russia. This is one of the major reasons why revolutionary socialists cannot support Chinese Stalinism any more than they can support Stalinism anywhere else. I wish people would think that. Ernest Mandel, for instance, prominent leader of the Fourth International, wrote introductions to 3 volumes of Marx's Capital, characterized Mao's China as a worker state, which is clear, and that was like later. This was not early. Clearly, and this is like, we're already seeing here, the splits within Trotskyism really manifesting. I mean, I don't think that, for example, like I think that the Fourth International, to my understanding at least, might be wrong, actively supported Stalinism when it came in Yugoslavian form or Chinese form, merely condemning it in the USSR. Defining the states established out of the so-called people's democracies in Eastern Europe as deformed worker states, because large swaths of the economy were nationalized. Anyway, let me get back to the text. Just not talking out loud to myself. This is one of the major reasons why revolutionary socialists cannot support Chinese Stalinism any more than revolutionary socialists can support Stalinism anywhere else. Far from bringing peace to China, the Communist Party, no less than the Kuomintang, will involve China in vast international imbroglios. What the fuck is an imbroglio? If you know what an imbroglio is, congratulations. Because I do not. An imbroglio, an extremely confused, complicated, or embarrassing situation. For instance, the Watergate imbroglio. The archaic use of the word refers to a confused heap. So I guess an embarrassing mess. Far from bringing peace to China, the Communist Party, no less than the Kuomintang, will involve China in vast international imbroglios and eventually in a war in which it has no possible interest. This is the terrible price Stalinism exacts for Stalinism's conquests. The British historian R.H. Tawney has written that he who achieves an alleviation of the abysmal human degradation which is the lot of the Chinese peasant will win the support of 500,000 villages. This is the limitless source which feeds the Stalinist flood. The Communist Party has become a peasant party in that it seeks its base primarily in the countryside, and that it has developed a theory which gives leadership of the Chinese social revolution to the peasant class through the instrumentality of the Communist Party. It has not been connected with the struggles of the workers for over a decade. It has not had power in any sizable city. The Communist Party is a rural party, and the Communist Party's entire outlook and membership is rural, as is most of its leadership. The problem of workers and cities are foreign to it. It's kind of like an interesting dynamic that's political base of operations is in the cities. But to my understanding, in China up until today and during the Mao period, one of the main stratifications in the society was that between city and countryside. The people who lived in the cities, to my understanding at least, I might be talking out my ass, for instance, did not bear the brunt of at all of the devastation, the human devastation of the Great Leap Forward, which killed probably 30 million people. maybe more, maybe less. Yeah. So, and I think that like there was like pretty severe restrictions about who could live in the countryside. I mean, who could live in the cities and who could not. Um, there was a lot of people trying to get to the cities that were blocked from getting to the cities. Um, if you lived in the city, you had, you might get access to working in a state-owned enterprise, which gave you a pretty comfortable, to my understanding, I might be talking about as pretty comfortable you know, conditions of existence relatively. So it was called, which I believe was called the so-called Iron Rice Bowl, um, which I think has been consistently under attack for the past 40 or so years. Um, but yeah, so it's like a rurally based peasant army. And this is always like one of the things that is important, I think, to consider, just as a side note, is that one of the reasons it's not just that like a lot of people, especially like kind of like Maoisty kind of people, if you talk to them, will say something like, one of the things they disagree with, for instance, with Marx, and think that Bakunin was right about, which is clearly I don't think much of Bakunin was right, but was this kind of like viewing like the lumpen proletariat as a revolutionary uh, agent, um, which is saying who would be a revolutionary agent and who would not be is a complicated question, and like I don't think really has too it can never really have too firm of an answer. It's not speculative or just like immediately empirical about like what is actually happening on the ground at any particular situation. But one of the things that one of the reasons that amongst other reasons why um, the revolutionary that in traditional Marxism, at least, and Marx, I think this is true of Marx as well, viewed the revolutionary actors, at least in industrialized society, as the working class, is because the working class um, was actually to take power as a class, like it actually institute a kind of a socialist democracy, um, and were capable and schooled enough in you know those practices from its own movement uh, to create a kind of a substantially self-ruled, self-managed uh, type of socio-political economic situation. They would be able to achieve that, as opposed to merely supporting someone who holds out arms to them. And that's a very important like critique in like the Communist Manifesto, for instance, where like um, uh, military and political support for a body of reformers who hand out alms is not the same thing as socialism. So, for instance, like just because you can find discontented peasants and discontented all kinds of people to take up arms and potentially and combat the state and overthrow the state and establish something, um, is not really what a socialist revolution is. Hypothetically, you could overthrow uh, all kinds of governments, but the conditions for socialism are, at least in Marx's view, are definitely more complicated than merely overthrowing a government. Um, so, um, yeah, that's basically all I was basically saying there. I was trying to talk to myself. Is basically that uh, having popular support or having people willing to fight in your army is not the same as the people who constitute that support substantially controlling uh, their social, leading in a self-emancipatory direction towards controlling their own social world. Anyway, that was just a thought I was having at the time of reading this. So, it has not been connected with the struggles of the workers for over a decade. The Communist Party of China. The CCP has not had power in any sizable city. The CCP is a rural party, and its entire outlook and membership is rural, as is most of its leadership. The problems of workers in cities are foreign to the CCP. Nowhere else in modern history has a national revolution been led by a party based on the peasantry. The unique Chinese experience is possible because Stalinism is that unifying ingredient which is absent in the peasantry as a class. With Stalinism's discipline, ideology, leadership, and indefatigable organizational labor, Stalinism creates cohesion and gives unified direction. An extremely revealing and frightening statement of the Stalinist theory of the Chinese Revolution has been made by Liu Shuxi, member of the Central Committee, and next to Mao Zedong, the leading theoretician. It is worth quoting at length. Is that Liu Shaoqi? Xiaoqi? I'm not sure. It's spelled Liu Hsiauchi. The leading theoretician, Anyway, the leading theoretician, an extremely revealing and frightening statement of the Stalinist theory of the Chinese Revolution has been made by Liu Shaoqi, member of the Central Committee, and next to Mao Zedong, the leading theoretician. It is worthy quoting at length. A.L. Strong, the reporter of his remarks, paraphrase Liu, quote, even the concept of the, quote, proletariat, end quote, bracket, quotation marks in the original, end bracket, as a base for the Communist Party is given a new meaning, end quote. And Liu says, quote, all this, bracket, proletarian leadership, end bracket, applies to the Western world. But in China, we have only a few such people. Of our 500 million people, only 2 or 3 million can be called industrial workers, whom the imperialists and capitalists are training to be the reserves of the Communist Party someday. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong is training 2 or 3 million from another kind of people who are not only no less disciplined and devoted, but in fact perhaps even more disciplined and devoted than the industrial workers. China has only a few industrial workers to be the foundation, but we have millions of kids, bracket, Communist Party youth, end bracket, like this. Such people have never known Marx, but they are brought up in the spirit of communism. Their discipline and devotion to public affairs is no less than that of industrial workers. They give their lives to the fight against foreign imperialism and native oppressors even when very young. They fight now for the, quote, new democracy. But if in the future it is time to build socialism, they will be ready to build socialism. If it is time for communism, they will be ready for that also. Only one thing they will not build or accept, the old form of capitalism, ... Today, we are building capitalism, but it is a, quote, new capitalism. As the core of this, quote, new democracy and, quote, new capitalism, we have 3 million people, the army, the party, and the government, who have lived for 20 years in what might be called, quote, military communism. It is not the, quote, military communism they had in Russia, for here it is applied only to this leading group, bracket, the army, the party, and the state of 3 millions, end bracket. Amerasia, June 1947, page 162 to 63. In her comment on this statement, Anna L. Strong, I think it's Anna Louise Strong, is that what the L is? Not sure. Quote, China's revolution is a peasant revolution. China's revolution's basic characteristic is that the peasants, not the workers, form the principal mass that resist the oppression of foreign capital and leftover medieval elements in the countryside. In the past, Marxist analysis has not been applied to guide such a revolution, end quote. Since 1927, Stalinism has not been a political party in China, but an armed camp, an embryo state. Party members and leaders were equivalent to state officials. Sometimes the fortunes of the state party were low indeed, as after the Long March when it was reduced to 40,000. In those days and even today, not only were and are party and state identical, but the two are coefficients of the army's power and are identical with it too. Liu is exaggerating when he says, quote, "We have 3 million people who have lived 20 years in what might be called, quote, military communism," end quote, unquote. For the present Communist Party, an army of 2.5 million to 3 million are post-war developments. But the process Liu so clearly describes is important. For 20 years, this group, acting as a state, military, and political power isolated from the working class and the cultural influences of the coast cities, has developed a hard bureaucratic core. Carefully selected through numerous purges, the leadership is a tight, homogeneous hierarchy. Not part of the peasantry, its self-arrogated role is to lead, organize, discipline, and provide policy for the peasant, but never to become part of the peasant's class. While the peasant remains the atomized mass it naturally is, the Communist Party takes its best sons to itself and manipulates the real needs of the masses in the Communist Party's struggle for power. All this it does consciously. Relations between party and class are fixed from above. The bureaucracy for the entire country is developed in advance, in isolation, almost in laboratory fashion. This is the cadre of the state which advances with military victory, carries through the agrarian policy, and organizes the new citadels of political power. It deals with social groupings as a separate entity and by retention of its social independence determines the relationship between classes on the basis of the needs of its own rule. Thus, Liu informs us that the policy for today is construction of a, quote, new capitalism, but that the party retains the liberty to move against this, quote, new capitalism and its economic classes when it decides the time has come for, quote, socialism. It is the party, or more accurately, the state party army, which is the bearer of historic change, no matter in whose name it acts at the moment. A close study of Mao Zedong's writings indicates, as Liu implies in the opening sentences above, that the Communist Party considers itself the leader of the nation, of all classes in Chinese society, and as such it fulfills a program which is above classes, i.e., in its own interest as the state power. This Bonapartist conception gives the Communist Party great tactical flexibility. At the same time, it is a theory of social revolution, but not of the bourgeois democratic revolution, nor of the proletarian socialist revolution. It is the theory of the bureaucratic collectivist revolution. The social revolution, which is clamoring for birth in China as elsewhere in Asia, is conquered and distorted. As Liu puts it, quote, "Today we are building capitalism," end quote. But it is a, quote, new capitalism like the, quote, new democracies of Eastern Europe, and for this a national alliance of classes eases the ascent to power and also serves to keep the masses quiescent. But as Mao put it so succinctly, quote, "The united front must be under the firm leadership of the Communist Party," end quote. But when, quote, "it is time to build socialism," bracket, read Stalinism, end bracket, end quote, after the consolidation of power, the Communist Party, quote, "will be ready for that also," end quote. This is the answer to those who speculate about the Chinese Communist Party following a path different from that of Stalinism elsewhere. When placed against the background of the Great Revolution of 1925 to 1927, the most striking feature of current events in China is the absence of the working class in an active role. Where are Canton's millions who in 1925 challenged the might of foreign gunboats and Kuomintang warlords, gave power to Kuomintang, and forced their way into the CP by tens of thousands? Where are the heroic masses of working men who paved the way for the Northern Expedition by their independent militancy? The steelworkers and coal miners of Hankow and Wuhan are silent today, but in the turbulent years 2 decades ago, They performed miracles, defied the British gunboats, organized mass unions in the cities and organizations of the poor peasants in the countryside, and still had enough to man the armies of the Kuomintang. Later, the quote left Kuomintang. And until later, when Chiang's terror had wounded and bled the aroused giant of China's revolution, and Stalinism had eviscerated its spirit, this proletariat was still capable of the final defiance of the Canton Commune. It was under the leadership of this great urban class that the peasantry organized the struggle against medieval leftovers and militarist tyranny. The democracy of the upheaval was self-evident in the rise of local leaderships everywhere, freedom from traditional restraints, the enormously rapid progress in political education of millions of the submerged and illiterate. The people held the stage and the workers took the lead, aligning themselves with and creating political groups which acted on the people's needs. The masses taught the leaders, very often marching far ahead of them. The revolution in the villages was not a peasant revolt in geographic or social magnitude, but under the advanced lead of the proletariat, it took on the radical character of an agrarian revolt, not reform. Ties between the urban and rural masses were indissoluble in the common struggle. This heroic popular social movement of 20 years ago is a measure of the conservative, manipulated, primarily military march of Stalinism today. Today, the Chinese proletariat does not have a party of its own. The Chinese proletariat is not an active, organized, cohesive social class. The Chinese proletariat does not have a program of leadership to express its desires in the present situation. The intervening decades have brought cumulative disasters. When the Canton Commune was suppressed, thousands of workers were slaughtered, and the Kuomintang reaction in every city followed the massacre of the militants. Police terror, assisted by underworld hoodlumism and secret police, established a regime over the working class which did not permit widespread organization. With the best militants assassinated or in hiding, the proletariat was left leaderless and beheaded. The links with the peasantry were broken, political organization was non-existent. The treason of Stalinist policy culminated in the exodus to the south. The workers were abandoned by the Kuomintang. Many of the surviving militants left the CP peasant armies for the hills and mountains of south-central Asia. The CP desertion of the cities was a betrayal from which the workers never recovered. After these shattering defeats, even an underground of serious proportions could not develop. And on occasions since 1927, the Communist Party has raided the cities and universities for new leadership elements which had aroused the police of the Kuomintang. This has been the relationship the Communist Party has had with the urban workers. In addition to police terror and gangsterism, the Kuomintang organized the workers into its own, quote, blue unions. When after the war even these, quote, unions became restive, Chu Sen-fan, Kuomintang appointed president of the Chinese Federation of Labor, was driven to exile in Hong Kong. Chu joined with Marshal Li in the Kuomintang Revolutionary League and is now a Stalinist front in the recently launched Labor Federation. Under Japanese and puppet rule, the workers were unable to raise their heads. They were cut off from the anti-Japanese struggle. It is a weakened class which has not recovered from the disasters of 1927 and the subsequent 20 years of oppression. These were the cumulative disasters which permitted the control of the revolution and its transformation into a new reaction by the Communist Party. The Communist Party of 1948 is not the party of 1928. The Communist Party of 1948 does not look upon the workers as the leading class. The Communist Party of 1948's attitude towards the workers is that the workers are necessary for production and to carry out directives, but its politics are not directed toward the workers. Piecework and speed-up have been made universal. Production quotas for the individual worker as well as for each productive unit are established. Payment is made according to achievement. The entire Stalinist incentive system has been introduced under oppressive conditions. Stakhanovism and, quote, labor heroes are the means of establishing fear on the job, for it is not well to fail to meet the goals set by the pace setters. Quote, labor heroes receive public awards and state recognition in the presence of their fellow workers. congresses of, quote, labor heroes are held at which methods of speed up are discussed. The process of differentiation in the factory is begun with the new, quote, labor heroes being set up above their class. Since the Communist Party is tied to its agrarian base, it will project the cost of industrialization onto the workers as the only class from which the tremendous burdens that are inevitable in such a program can be safely extracted. From this indicated assumption, we may conclude that Stalinism will from the beginning be especially oppressive to the workers of China. With their first contact with cities, there are already reports of declining standards of living. One second. In its relation to the working class, the Chinese Communist Party acts as a ruling bureaucracy exercising state power. The Chinese Communist Party's separation from urban culture and urban classes, and the Chinese Communist Party's complete Stalinization in the last 20 years has transformed the Chinese Communist Party into a party alien to the proletariat. The Chinese Communist Party is a bureaucratized agrarian party. The Chinese Communist Party does not even manipulate the workers through detailed control of its organizations because its estrangement is so complete. During August 1947, in the Manchurian city of Harbin, the Communist Party began to reestablish connections with the urban working class through an all-China Labor Congress. Delegates are supposed to have come from Kuomintang cities representing underground unions. It is significant that it is 3 years after the war and almost an equal period of Communist Party rule in Manchuria that such a Congress is called. The scanty reports available on this meeting are all from official Stalinist sources. What comes through clearly is that the workers were given no role in the overthrow of the Kuomintang, except to, quote, prepare to welcome the People's Liberation Army and to support and take part in revolutionary movements of the people, bracket, that is, the Communist Party, Jack Brad, end bracket, end quote. Relations to the capitalist class are carefully defined, quote, ... Workers should make a distinction between the, quote, comprador capitalist of the ruling bureaucracy and a national capitalist who are oppressed. They should endeavor to win the latter for struggle against imperialism and the Kuomintang, end quote. The final official resolutions of the Congress established 2 programs for labor, one for Kuomintang areas and one for the, quote, liberated areas. These statements are important statements of policy in Kuomintang areas. 1. I guess I should say quotes. I'm sorry. In Kuomintang areas, quote, 1. The consolidation of their bracket workers end bracket own strength and the expansion of their fighting ranks so as to prepare the arrival of the Liberation Army. 2. Cooperation with national industrialists in their common fight against the bureaucratic capitalists. 3. The dispatch of skilled technicians into the liberated areas. ... 4. The protection of all factories and machines. Bracket, China Digest, August 21st, 1948, end bracket. The relation of the workers to the communist parties is clearly defined as a passive one of, quote, preparing for the Communist Party armies to take power. If there is to be a, quote, liberation, the Communist Party will bring it, and this task is exclusively and uniquely the Communist Party's. In the Directive on Administration of Newly Conquered Cities, China Digest, August 13th, 1948, the Central Committee orders, quote, all law-abiding enemy functionaries, personnel of economic and educational organs, and policemen should not be taken prisoner or arrested. They must be given duties and remain at their original post under the orders of definite organs and personnel to watch over their original organs, end quote. The directive very carefully states the role of each section of the bureaucracy and bourgeoisie, but is not one single word on the part of the workers or their organizations are to have in their, quote, liberation and reorganization of the cities. On the contrary, every effort is made, as the above quotation shows, to keep the administration intact until the Communist Party political commissars arrive to take over. Those, quote, who violate these policies must be thoroughly taken to task, ... end quote. The policy is fixed and imposed, and woe to him of any class who dares to struggle against it. In relation to the Civil War, the Communist Party pursues a conservative military policy. Popular activities independent of the Communist Party's own troops are frowned upon. There's no call for workers or peasants to rise in revolt in Kuomintang areas. Social policy is likewise a function arrogated by the Communist Party and carefully imposed by prior bureaucratic determinations of its limits, stages, and methods. Every last element of spontaneity or mass participation is strained out of the movement. In this way, the entire direction of the real social revolution, which is the profoundest desire of the people, is transformed into a new tyranny of bureaucratic collectivism. The, quote, new democracy, end quote, of Stalinism does not aim at eliminating the bourgeoisie or the agrarian rich at this time. The only group put out of the pale of acceptance by the Communist Party is the Kuomintang itself. With all other classes, it proposes a period of, quote, joint reconstruction. In order to carry through such a program, the Communist Party of China must guarantee the quiescence of the masses. However, this does not constitute a surrender by the Communist Party to native capitalism. Nothing would be further from the mark, for the power of all classes is strictly defined and limited by the Communist Party, with all real power. I think it's supposed to be with all real power. Through the Communist Party's control of the peasant unions and the village poor, the Communist Party can and will launch an offensive against the new kulaks, which the Communist Party's present policy is producing. Through similar methods in the cities, the Communist Party will, when it is decided, be able to use the workers and the petty bourgeoisie against the capitalists. The Communist Party, by the Communist Party's position above the classes, manipulates all of them for its own state needs. The class struggle is replaced by class manipulation. This is the actual relationship which is emerging under the, quote, new democracy. Instead of a pro-labor state, we have the emergence of an anti-labor state. Instead of a peasant power, an anti-peasant power. In the name of democracy, the new tyranny of Stalinism arises out of the failure of capitalism and proletarian independence. It is hardly likely, since no serious alternative exists, that the urban working class will be able to avoid the fatal embrace of the Communist Party. Yet it will take a long time before this party's roots are secure among the workers. Memories of the betrayal of 1927 persist among older workers, and tendencies to reject the labor-capitalist collaboration policy of the Communist Party are inevitable. A period of hegemonic chaos is probable, and restlessness with Communist Party rule and with the bourgeoisie will develop. Also, Stalin's labor policy is one of intensified work and increasing production at labor's expense. The agrarian policy of Stalinism tends to create a newly rich kulak in the villages who will threaten the food supplies of the cities. All this is in prospect, and sailing will not be easy for the new masters. That the present Stalinist revolution in China is led from and gives prior leadership to the villages is of enormous importance. Much of the peculiar political maneuvering in China today, the coalition program of the Communist Party, its hesitancy to utilize the masses except under the closest control, its slogan of, quote, return the factories to their owners, end quote, arise from this original difficulty. The Communist Party may actually be unable to organize and administer all of China because of this alienation. The key to the uprooting of feudalism, to a modern revolution in the village as well as national unification, lies in the cities. Unless modern transport and communications are constructed, the country cannot be held together physically. Unless agriculture is reorganized to the needs of industry, city and country will not be integrated. Only an industrially oriented agriculture can create the mentality which will accept sharp breaks from traditional peasant patterns and introduce new methods adapted to local use, as well as deal with such otherwise, quote, insoluble problems, end quote, as land fragmentation. The lesson of the Great Revolution of 1927 is the very opposite of that stated by Liu above. The revolutionary urban masses, at the head of which was the working class, did prove sufficient to take and organize the power. The Stalinists have put this tremendous dynamic force in fetters, substituting themselves for it. It may well be that its alienation from the working class will prove to be the Achilles heel of Chinese Stalinism. ... New International, December 1948.